Amen. It's the last presentation of the camp meeting and the last of mine. I struggled to know what to do today. Because the intention of this camp meeting was to come back to our document how the Constitution became Christian. And we finally completed our introduction. So I've decided to not treat this presentation as a conclusion. That won't work. We will make some points along our journey, but it will be carried through into whenever our next meetings are. This document is not our template. As was stated at our last camp meeting, the Midnight Cry gave us 3 particular structures. The Alpha and Omega of modern Israel, this was to teach us about ourselves, God's people. The counterfeit, that was designed to teach us about the papacy. The study of In God We Trust, designed to teach us about Protestantism. So we have covered Adventism, Catholicism, Protestantism. And God is teaching us about all 3 through their structures. Each one is covering the history from the time of the end. And whether it's the history of Adventism, Catholicism, or Protestantism, we can see they have 2 histories of failure with a final success. Even their structures follow a same pattern. So what we are tracing is not so much modern Israel, Adventism. It is not Catholicism. It is Protestantism. Because it is Protestantism that enacts the Sunday law. And we are in the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law. That is our template. The structures that were already given 2 years ago. This document adds a lot of information onto that structure. It helps guide us. But along that journey, we're going to add information from other sources. And give context. We want to understand why there will be a Sunday law, where it will come from, who will enact it, and what it will be about. These studies all clarify that for us. I've put a quote up on the board. Review and Herald, December 24. (1889), paragraph 1. First sentence. I have been much burdened in regard to movements that are now in progress for the enforcement of Sunday observance. The point made in 2019, 18 months ago now, was that Ellen White stands here when she says that. In the history of failure, not just for Adventism, but for Protestantism. She stands in this first history of this first movement and talks about the work that is then in progress. In 1889, 130 years ago, that she says will lead to the National Sunday Law. The second sentence says that Satan is working earnestly to bring this about. Then she says plans are being advanced through various Protestant denominations. She describes a secrecy that can be easily misunderstood. These actions were not invisible. Last sentence. If the people can be led to favour a Sunday law, then the clergy intend to exert their united influence to obtain a religious amendment to the Constitution and compel the nation to keep Sunday. What is the problem with that sentence? We tend to focus on the first. There are movements in progress 130 years ago she says will lead to the Sunday law. Those movements are largely dead now. So we make a decision. We throw away her writings. leave Adventism. We become a really Laodicean blind Adventist and stay in the church. Or we reason together. Through a strict, perfect methodology structures. It's not just the movements of this history that they died. What is the title of this document all about? The Constitution used to be viewed as a pagan document. That needed to be amended. Fast forward 100, 200 years, Protestantism largely looks at that constitution now as a Christian document. And the question that Jared Goldstein is trying to answer is, how did that happen? How did they go from wanting to amend the Constitution to now interpreting it as already Christian? In her last sentence of this paragraph, she shows that it's more than about Sunday. It's their desire to amend the Constitution. That movement died. If you can see that the issues in this history are no longer to amend the Constitution, if you can acknowledge that there has been a change between where she stood and where we stand, want to amend the Constitution? There's a mixture here between amendment and interpretation. And this is all interpretation. So what she says about the Constitution here no longer applies. And if what she says about the Constitution has transformed, what she says about the Sunday law issue has also transformed. We need to see the transformation from the movements then in progress to the movements here in progress, to the movements now in progress. Constitution, their view of the Constitution has transformed. And it's not the only issue that has transformed over these three movements. Tracking their course will bring us much more clarity on the issue in the movements today. So we're going to move quickly over a review. First Great Awakening in the 1700s. Key figure, George Whitefield. Became a fight between more strict and more liberal views of Calvinism. The conservatives called the liberals emotional. That they used emotionalism in their revivals. Second Great Awakening. Key figure, Charles Finney. Old school versus new school. Conservatives versus liberals. And that's a theological fight over Calvinism. Same as the First Great Awakening. Especially when it comes to doctrines such as predestination, that no longer fit their Republican view as an American citizen. The conservatives accuse these liberal revivalists of using emotionalism. Two streams developed through Protestantism. They find their base in different universities. Yale switched from a conservative to a liberal university early on. Which is why you see many Republicans and conservatives today attack universities. Breeding grounds of liberalism and sin. Adventism has had similar views. But you can trace much of it back to how these universities stood through the Great Awakenings. Princeton became a bulwark of conservatism. Fundamentalist conservatism, Calvinism. I want to quote A. Hodge. He led Princeton for some of their most significant years. Princeton claimed that the Calvinism of the Reformation had been preserved without flaw at Princeton. We've already traced Calvinism through the Covenanters And they would say that that hadn't changed at all. They'd held on to all of those old Calvinist principles. Hodge declared, "I am not afraid to say that a new idea never originated in this seminary." How can you have a new idea when the old ideas are perfect? This is conservatism in its most literal sense. It completely rejects any concept of progression or restoration. And if you reject what we teach about progression, you have to agree with Hodge when he says the following. For the translators, this is in the document under Princeton. "And if Christ is Lord of lords and King of kings, if he is really the ruler among the nations, then all nations are in a higher sense one nation, under one king, one law, having one interest and one end. There cannot be two laws for Christians, one to govern the relations of individuals and the other the relations of nations." To make an application of what he just said, you can't have one law that says a Christian keeps the Sabbath for them Sunday and not have that impact the national state law. You can't separate the two. One nation under one king, one law. Not separate laws for individuals and then state laws. In summary, no separation between church and state. That is Calvinism, the doctrine of the Covenanters, old school thinking, fed through Princeton Seminary. The first and the second Great Awakenings were rebellions against that. The reason that so many in the Protestant hierarchy hated these awakenings is because those ministers taught the people to free themselves from the hierarchy. It was like a revolution. And the hierarchy started to lose power. So it became a fight over power. These awakenings also started to pull away from more orthodox Calvinism. So say it's 1840. A message comes that cuts away at Orthodox Calvinism, requires you to be willing to sever yourself from your denominational hierarchy, to listen and follow nobodies in the church system, to think and reason. Can you do that if you sided with the old school in a second great awakening? You can't do that. The fight, separate to the Millerites, was, will you at all costs cling to your denominational leaders, those influential men, or are you willing to think for yourself and sever from them? People who'd sided with Calvinism and the old school had already made their decision. Before they may have ever heard of William Miller. Does that make sense? Can you already see the parallels to today? That there is a work being done separate to this movement today. It's largely separate from religion. But Protestants, everyone then was Protestants. They've already been divided into two streams. Now, people sided with the Millerites. They felt compelled. That message was truth. And if you go through spiritual gifts, as Ellen White goes back and covers that history, what does she say the Protestant ministers were doing? People would try and break free from their companies. And through vision, she could see that these ministers had been binding them together again. So no one could pull away from their denominations, their fellowships. These ministers were attempting to hold on to their people, onto power. If you'd already sided with the old school in the Second Great Awakening, if you'd already submitted yourself to be bound by that hierarchy, it would be extremely difficult for you to separate yourself and join the Millerites. Not only that, if you were not willing to question your ancient Calvinist traditions and teachings, I've been taught from a young age, my grandparents were taught, we almost universally all believe in predestination. I won't question. The message of William Miller could have none effect. You needed to be pulled from conservative Calvinism and be willing to be severed from your Protestant leadership. And that work had already begun externally. Really from the 1790s. Remember the paragraph that we looked at briefly yesterday? I'll just summarize for time. Life Sketches 80, Chapter 5. Where were Ellen White's parents taking her? To the meetings of the Second Great Awakening. Now we can see this had both positive effects and negative effects. The positive was that they were on the right stream to join William Miller once they heard that message. I would suggest if they had have been in this stream, there would be no Ellen White. So external streams, Ellen White and her family are in the correct stream. Now, last dispensation, that would have been as far as we went. Life and death, they're on the stream that would lead to life. The stories of the Hiddekel and the Ulai. Now we want to add the complication. What did Charles Finney say? People are lazy and distracted. How do you break down the laziness and the distraction? A tidal wave of emotionalism. I want to read from Life Sketches 80, 139.2. She says she had attended Methodist meetings. Her parents took her to a Methodist camp meeting. She was resolved to seek the Lord there, to find forgiveness from her sin. Paragraph 139.3. Do you have that in the document, Sister Anna? Some things at this camp meeting perplexed me exceedingly. I could not understand the exercises of many persons during the conference meetings at the stand and in the tents. They shouted at the top of their voices, clapped their hands, and appeared greatly excited. Quite a number fell, through exhaustion it appeared to me, but those present said they were sanctified to God, and this wonderful manifestation was the power of the Almighty upon them. After lying motionless for a time, these persons would rise and again talk and shout as before. She talks further down about the people who become sick. From the excitement and loss of sleep. At another place, she talks about the mental illnesses that develop from the emotionalism and the fear. Especially the fear. These were tactics that these travelling ministers used in the Second Great Awakening. This caused her so much heartache as a young person. They gave her no relief but increased her discouragement. And this is one place where you see her fall into despair. Then she accepts the message of the Millerites. This is 150.3. She's observing these people who have embraced the Second Great Awakening. They've given the physical manifestations of emotionalism that were required. They're crying, they're clapping, they're claiming to love Jesus. Yet when they are presented with a message that says that same Jesus is about to return, they manifest bitterness. Ellen White is confused. This did not seem to be the manifestation of the holiness which they professed. And the majority of the people who embraced the Second Great Awakening did not embrace Millerism. Two external streams. One will lead you to death, one will lead you to life. But only if you don't stay in that stream. You needed to come from the New School stream and become a Millerite. As they cry they love Jesus, they're going to be presented with the 2300 days and tested. It's all being repeated today. Two external streams, world divided. Those who have clung to Donald Trump and republicanism and conservatism. Racism, sexism, homophobia. They cannot sever themselves from that to join us. But for the millions who wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts, who claim to believe in equality, who claim to love. Back here where everyone's Protestant, we would just say love Jesus. But for the millions today who just claim to love, they will be tested. And the test will be that they can't just stay, they need to join us. They need every part of this message. Now, the shaking we had last year was because people did not see this transition. They thought, Michael Moore gets it. I don't know how, but somehow they thought Hollywood gets it. A liberal atheist world gets it. We should be going this way, not this way. This is just one evidence that if they claim to get it, they join us. And what they needed to accept was every single thing on that chart. You say you love Jesus, here's the 2300-day prophecy. I'm not sure which part I'm to repeat. People have thought that the world is so much better than this movement. I'm not sure what in the world they think is better than this movement. I've seen enough of the world to know they don't get equality. No no matter what slogans they wear on their t-shirts. In this history, if someone said they loved, they were tested with a chart. They look at that chart and they cannot see love in every part. Is the love in the emotion, or is the love in accepting the 2300-day prophecy? They would say emotion, we would say prophecy. We have been faced with the same issue. Can people see the love in the vows of this movement? Many can't. But I would suggest they are there. Just as the evidence of the love was found in the 1843 chart. Death, life. But only if you could make the transition to be a Millerite. Because what they claimed had to be tested. People externally who appear to be on the right side today they will be tested. I'm not sure if you know the Lincoln Project. They were Republicans who now attack Trump and the Republican Party. You would think they are here. Their methods and treatment of the people they disagree with is disgusting. And they claim to love. It is not enough to be anti-Trump or wear a t-shirt. Coming to the Sunday law, everyone will be tested. So are we ready to go back to our document? We'll just touch it. Is that okay, Brother Thato? We reviewed. This document begins with an introduction. I'm not going to spend time on review, much time. We discussed this first history at the last camp meeting. He says in the introduction that he is tracing the Constitution from being a godless document to being the highest expression of the nation's Christian identity. How that perception changed over 3 specific movements. How these 3 movements all follow the same pattern. Movement 1. There's a group threat. the prototypes start to panic. Through what he describes as a nationalistic response. And then they make demands based on the Constitution. This is true for all three movements. On page 267, he lays out who the threat was. So this is where Ellen White stands. And the threat that the Protestantism is responding to is from Catholics, Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, and free thinkers. Now, in 1888, would they have elected a Catholic president? No. They are not friends. It's important for us to understand that. Catholicism is the threat. Coming through who they consider to be dirty Irish immigrants. But so many, especially Irish, were coming into the country. People were afraid. Because the Catholics are saying, we don't want to send our Catholic children to a state school, public school, and have them taught your version of Protestantism. Jews, Adventists, and free thinkers are all saying the same thing. So these four encapsulate a threat. And they weren't hiding the fact that they felt threatened. The document will speak about that. I want to just spend a moment on free thinking. So we are about to end. I want to summarize this first history and make a final point. But I suspect many people aren't sure what free thinkers were. Two Wikipedia pages. If you just look up free thought, that will give you some information. But look up the golden age of free thought. And that will tell you that this golden age was the late 1800s. really began to be more a formalised movement in the 1870s. They had a couple of famous orators who led them. You may know of Robert G. Ingersoll. So they were becoming quite influential. In the midst of this history of Protestantism feeling threatened. And what free thinkers thought was the following. Up till now, they all sound so positive. Doesn't everyone want to be a free thinker? I would say anything that I believe cannot be because of an authority, tradition, revelation, or dogma. It can only be based on logic, reason, and studied evidence. Empirical observation. And this particularly applies for religious teaching. This might seem awfully close to what Elder Paminda taught this morning. I would argue it's not the same thing. When they say you cannot believe something based on authority, or revelation, they do away completely with the concept of inspiration. The Bible, a man-written document. Might say something about history. If you can't prove a king existed, he didn't exist. Doesn't matter what the Bible says. And this had recently been empowered by a particular book written by Charles Darwin that seemed to give them logic, reason, and empirical observation. So they've transformed over time. Back then, most free thinkers were agnostics. Today there are few agnostics, most just become atheists. Because they cannot trust in documents that they believe are man-written. And it's particularly been influential through Charles Darwin. It's a rebellion against really any form of religious authority. So they're a threat. It all begins with this issue of the Civil War, the Covenanters largely lead out in that whole enterprise. They form the National Reform Association, that we should know of well because we're Adventists. After the Civil War, they restructure this organisation. They go through a transformation. And between the end of the Civil War and 1888, they're seeing more and more of these four threats. And they're mobilising to oppose them. Now, again, you had two external streams in this history. To oppose the NRA, another association formed called the Free Religious Association. Adventists steered clear of both. We charted our own course. So the National Reform Association in response and as an attack another group formed the Free Religious Association. It's all about equality. Adventists did not get involved in this. They later formed the Liberty League in the 1890s. So by the time you get to 1888, what demands are Protestants making? What do they want done? Amend the Constitution and enact a Sunday law. If they were to just enact a Sunday law, remember, they are the prototype. These do not belong. If they enact a Sunday law, it takes care of the free thinkers. The nation is following Protestantism from the top levels of government. Takes care of Adventists and Seventh-day Baptists. Takes care of Jews. Doesn't take care of Catholics. So you also very much need the amendment to the Constitution. Because this gives homage. obeisance, worship. This gives worship to Catholicism. You could have a Sunday law in a Catholic country. So they need to stipulate we are Protestant. Not Catholic. Their response is not random, it is calculated. To directly take down who they see as a threat. Three of the four are taken down by a Sunday law. The fourth, Catholicism, is taken down by an amendment to the Constitution. And if you have both, Protestantism is enshrined. The national identity protected. The prototype secured in the documents. I just want to make one point before we close, because we're going to tackle this one in more detail. But late 1940s is post-Second World War. This is Christianity. Protestantism, Christianity that's on the attack against these four. First World War, Second World War. And many fascist organisations completely trashed the name Christian through their use of it. A Christian organisation became associated with fascism. So they made another calculated move. Jews are no longer the threat. Because post-Second World War, you would not dare. Now they embrace the title the Judeo-Christian West. They were arresting and imprisoning Jews here. They've begun to transform because the threat has changed. Can they have a Sunday law now that they're the Judeo-Christian West? The response has to be an attack on the threat. The minute you change who the threat is, you have to change your methods of attack. The threat is communism. So now you're going to have a Billy Graham who's going to link capitalism with Protestantism. To protect the Judeo-Christian West. This is the McCarthy era. Yes. Jews are not the threat here. Therefore, you cannot have a Sunday law response. In fact, they've brought in the Jewish community as an ally. In the same history, Adventism is no longer a threat. First of all, there is no Sunday law now. If the Jews can keep Sabbath, we can keep Sabbath. And then, in that same history, we were so afraid of being called a cult because all of those people religiously following Calvin accused us of following Ellen White. And we let go of our identity. We're heading into the second, the third generations, prophetically speaking. Fourth generation, the sins of our fathers. Judeo-Christian West, Jews not a threat, Adventists not a threat. Catholicism, it's transforming. Communism is the threat, different response. Between 1950 and 1979, there are three movements. We will go through these two histories in more detail next time. I just want to summarize. Through this camp meeting, we have discussed different subjects. But they are completely linked. Externally, these Protestants believe they are the prototype. And it leads them into racism, sexism, and homophobia. Today, the fight against sexism in this movement has faced opposition because of the concept of a prototype. So we discussed the nature of heaven, the Godhead, Lucifer, the angels. 6,000 years of progression documented in the Bible. 66 books, all written by men, documenting that sexism that has pervaded humanity for the last 6,000 years. We should see transformation. You can see it clearly between the beginning and end of ancient Israel. But as our written inspiration ends here, we have to be willing to see that our transformation had not ended here. We're still in that process. you can see externally it's the old school of Hodge and Princeton that reject that. That is why they are the stream that carries the danger. That it is why it is the Falwells, not the liberal Clinton-Biden faction that enacts the Sunday law. Adventism, by and large, falls into the wrong stream. God has given us structures at the end of the world that will teach us the history from 1798 to now. The history of Catholicism, Protestantism, and Adventism. We're focusing on Protestantism because we want to understand the Sunday law. So we're tracing the fundamentalism and the liberalism. Not enough to be an external liberal. That will be tested. There are 3 movements of Protestantism, each trying to force their identity onto the nation because they see their identity threatened. In the history of Ellen White, these 4 were the threats. So she said that movement in progress would amend the Constitution and enact a Sunday law. To destroy the threat. We focus on ourselves, but we were one part of that. They had some successes, but they largely failed. Post-Second World War, new threat. They look at that threat, define it in nationalistic terms. The city on a hill against godless communism. Threat changes, response change. No longer are the Jews or Adventists a threat. It's a stepping stone between the first movement and the third. By the third, we're practically part of them. As an Adventist structure. That's why Adventism falls at the Sunday law. They gave up their identity here because they were accused of being a cult because they followed a person. Stopped being a threat. And no matter how many times a conservative Adventist preaches against the Sunday law, They have joined and walk in step with the daughters of Babylon. They can't see that they're on the same side. Different threat now, different response. And we are in the history when we're starting to understand what that will be. But it all brings us back around to this subject of equality. If you deal with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for how you have led your people. We see so much love in what you have done. May we understand what love is. I pray that we will see it in the messages and in the vows of this movement. Even in what we might not have imagined is love. We've reached the end of this camp meeting. I pray that people will be blessed as they contemplate on what was taught. That you will help our thinking to transform. That we might think and see as you think and see. And treat each other accordingly. You know the civil war that goes on in this movement for equality. There are so many vulnerable who are told what we teach. Incorrectly. By those who misunderstand or oppose us. We pray that you give people a clear understanding of what is being taught. A clear understanding of the structures and the lines. And that especially the vulnerable will be able to see and hear and accept. I pray that we will all see our personal need. Make an effort to have that upper room experience of uniting with each other. We're looking out at the movement, see that only comes with equality. Only that is causing unity. May people not just accept, may they practice. So we place each member in your hands. In Jesus' name, amen.